Hey everybody, it's me, Carl, with Carl's COVID Comics Challenge, episode 4. As many of you know, I'm doing this challenge both to keep my mind occupied during this COVID nightmare, but also to support our local comic book stores. The two that I support in general, Escape Pod Comics in New York and Legend Comics and Coffee in Omaha, Nebraska. Those are the two places that I have made friends, family, and oh, by the way, buy comic books from. I am a lapsed comic book fan. I feel like I have to mention that every once in a while, just so you're not angry at my reviews because I don't read single issue comics. I'm much more into um, European comics, maybe a few graphic novels. I've really pumped the brakes on my comic consumption. And I just don't have a love for the superheroes that I used to have. But in a situation like this, I was able to get a giant stack of comic books for a reasonable price at a time when there's not a lot of entertainment opportunities. It's something that you can do too, and you'll be helping out a small business that is very, very susceptible in this current climate. There was some bad news today. The bad news is that Diamond Distributors, the place that brings all the new comic books every Wednesday to comic book stores, is no longer going to accept any new stock from their individual suppliers. So there are not going to be new comics for a while. But your local comic book store, if they're still open, has a lot of stock on hand. They have issues from all the different weeks that they've come out, things you haven't read, things you passed on, things that you weren't aware of, or things they over ordered on, expecting there to be more of a buzz, but for some reason people cooled it that week. And so there's all these different factors that go into the play, but the fact of the matter remains there are a lot of comic books out there that have not been read sitting on shelves that have been paid for by these small businesses. And so the opportunity is there for you to take your money that you're going to use to entertain yourself during these shut in times, and you can choose rather than try to seek out one or two things that you've always been meaning to read, to buy a bunch of stuff that you didn't really consider before, and that's exactly what I did. Legend Comics and Coffee still offering drive up and curbside service as well as delivery through the mail, I should say. And Escape Pod Comics, as of today, still planning to ship things out if people have stuff that he has on the shelves already. He can ship it out to you. So you can still get new reading material from these places. And I would highly, highly recommend that you do so. Do what I did. Take whatever your budget is that you're going to use to help small business and then benefit yourself from that same purchase. Contact your local comic book shop. If you don't have a local comic book shop, contact Legend Comics and Coffee or Escape Pod Comics. You can get a hold of me in the comments below or on Twitter or Facebook or wherever you can find me, Carl Smith Writer at gmail.com. If you want to email me, I'm at Carl Smith Writer on Twitter. Facebook, I don't use so much unless you're a part of our book club, but get a hold of me and I will give you information and make the introduction so that you can help these businesses out and they can help you by getting you a bunch of reading material. We can clear the shelves of these back issues and we'll benefit from it and they'll benefit from it. This is stuff they've paid for already. This is stuff we haven't read yet. It's win-win. So rather than switch to digital, rather than look for that one or two trade paperbacks on eBay or Amazon that you always wanted to finish reading but just never got around to, maybe utilize that money differently in these times and help out a local comic shop. And again, borrow one of my two favorite comic shops if you don't have one of your own. So today, from the giant stack of comics I purchased from Legend Comics and Coffee, I have 3 comics that I had never considered buying in my entire life. I pulled them out of the bag. There's sort of a theme here, which was unintentional. Again, they supplied me with mostly number ones and one shots, so that was merciful, even though it might have been fun. And we'll still get into some goofy mid-story reviews eventually. But I chose 3 books today. I had a little bit more time to read, and one of them didn't take much time. Two from Marvel, one from DC. So let's jump right in. The first one that I read is Star #1. I was completely unaware of who this person is. It is a new female hero or villain um, that is in Marvel. She has the what I'm deeming the stereotypical female hero or villain haircut, which is the underbuzz that's grown out and kind of a flop and long hair, so it's part feminine, part masculine, and it's a real women's soccer cut. And so I was a little confused because I thought she was Captain Marvel at first. But that confusion ended right away when she had a nightmare that Captain Marvel punched a hole through her chest, which apparently isn't just a metaphor. It really happened at some point in the Marvel Universe prior to this comic book. One of the things I wanted to point out is that Marvel's really good at doing this. On new issues, sometimes their #1s don't start off in #1 territory, but they do offer kind of a summation on the front page. They try to be cutesy about it. If it's something spider related, it looks like something that's on the Daily Bugle's webpage or on their newspaper. If it's something from S.H.I.E.L.D., it looks like an email that come across their intel system. But the fact that they bothered to provide it at all is nice because they're acknowledging that people are jumping in who are a little rusty or completely unaware of what's going on. So what we find out here is this particular person, Star, was, a reporter for a women's magazine. She was going to do a write-up on Ms. Marvel. She was kidnapped and tortured by villains of some sort, and yada yada yada. She has one of the Infinity Stones, the Reality Stone, pressed into her body, and no one can seem to get it out. So she's trying to cope with how to use this power and to use it responsibly. She's not exactly a hero. She sort of still thinks of herself as a bit of a villain, even though she hates the villains as well. And she just wants this problem solved. But a lot of people are trying to help her solve the problem in ways she doesn't want to. The issue was fine. I really felt like it read really well. It built this character up. There's a lot of questions I have, but you know what? It's not Marvel's job to explain its last 10 years of history to me in one comic book. Just because I jumped on at #1, I don't. It's not their responsibility. They just need to set up the character and move forward. I completely understood what was happening in this comic book and was able to follow the plot. I have some questions. There's some things that obviously were callbacks that I was unaware of. That's the nature of serialized fiction. And so I can't hold any of that against this comic book. The art was actually pretty good. I'm not really aware of the names of these artists. And if I could take a moment to just say, reviewing comic books is tedious. And it doesn't very... I don't know what the word would be. It doesn't take a lot of intelligence to do it poorly. And so I think there's a lot of comic book reviews out there. I think we had an age not long ago when everybody was a comic journalist, so to speak. But if you listen to any podcasts or read any websites that review comic books on a regular basis, they get tedious, they get repetitive. Whenever they try to sound like they're doing lit crit on a comic book, it just sounds terribly forced. You can tell they're in the wrong end of the pool. They try to comment on art when they've never really done anything other than just to kind of appreciate comic art as consumers. They really don't know the mechanics behind the scenes. Same with the story writing and so on. So it's really interesting from a standpoint of there's not a lot to say about these comic books other than react to them. And my reaction to Star #1 was it was worth the read. Whoops, I gave you the back side of it. It's worth the read. It's a heroic story in the building. You can tell there's going to be some redemption. There's some really terrible writing in here and some weird art choices that I do want to point out. And again, I'm trying to keep these somewhat positive, but there's a scene where Loki gets involved. And he's incognito, so he just has street clothes on. He has like a green vest and a green ball cap, but his ball cap has his horns. They're in green in it. And then later on, he immediately loses it and has his normal costume on. I think that's ridiculous. That is absolutely absurd. And the whole thing was just like, it pulled me out of the comic book. One thing I do like to do is put myself into these and say I'm going to buy in fully. Just like when I watch pro wrestling, I'm going to suspend my disbelief and let you entertain me. But all that I ask is that you don't do things that immediately pull the curtain aside and ruin the experience. And that was one of those things. It was stupid. It happened on like one panel. So, I could have easily blinked and missed it. But the minute I saw it, I couldn't unsee it and I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was ridiculous. There was a lot of characters in this book that showed up, disappeared. Which is sort of interesting. A lot of name dropping going on. They're building up this world because they have to establish where this star is going to function. Because is she a street level hero or villain like Daredevil? Is she cosmic? Is she mythical, magical? Is she high tech? There's all these different elements they have to try to figure out. And so far, what they've come up with is, yeah. So she's going to get dragged into a cosmic situation, I think. And that is evident by the character who arrives at the end of the comic, which is the Scarlet Witch, who has the most Scarlet Witch dialogue that I've ever read. I don't want to spoil that. I'll spoil that she appears, because she does nothing. She just appears. But she has terrible, terrible dialogue, so unbefitting of anything I've ever read with Wanda. Prior to that, there's an interaction with Jessica Jones, which was a very sanitary use of Jessica Jones, but yet very on point for her character. Although there was kind of a wordy info dump part to kind of establishing who Jessica Jones is that was kind of eye rolling. But overall, a pretty good comic book. Nothing that really tickles my fancy. But if I was to happen to find a pile of comics with the next issues in it, it would be something I'd be anxious to read just to see what happened to Star and where she developed. If there's anything in here that elevated this comic book from a 1 or a 2 score to higher, it is this: the inclusion of Titana. Titana is my favorite female villain in the Marvel Universe ever since Secret Wars. So I was loving seeing her in character and written well and wearing her full-on costume at the villain bar, although the villain bar trope is kind of old with me. But again, not a bad comic book. If you're going to drop $4 on a new comic, this isn't a terrible one. Star by Marvel. They're probably done with that title by now if you go back and find it. So something you can dig, and something that you can have your retailer, your comic supplier, your local comic book store find for you in abundance in these times when there's nothing else new coming out. So over to DC we go. So I had one tough girl kind of villain comic. The next one, tough girl kind of villain, mostly villain comic book. This is Harley Quinn, Villain of the Year one shot. Mark Russell's involved with it, which makes it, the writing is going to be at least enjoyable, even if it's something that was assigned to him. It was okay. Oh, I should go back and rate this one. 1 out of 5. Again, remembering that 1 doesn't mean a failure. It just means it didn't really do anything for me, even with my lower expectations. I give this a 3. I would read it again, right up there with Leviathan Dawn. I think both those series, if I was going to pick something off a newsstand, both of them, be totally willing to spend the money. So it was a decent comic book. Villain of the Year is a one shot. So once they got your money, they got your money. $4.99. It's a bigger comic book. The whole premise is they're doing an award show, and it's sort of a riff on how ridiculous the award shows are. And Harley Quinn is the host. They're giving out these most improved villain, scariest villain. You did it in memoriam, all the tropes. She changes costumes 100 times throughout the comic book. There's some really good gags in it. Again, Mark Russell's going to be good for that, and they're funny. But this is not the Flintstones, and it is far from anything else that he's written. It was. And I don't say this as a negative because I love Teen Titans Go, but this was a Teen Titans Go script that they just adapted for Harley Quinn. And I'm not a big Harley Quinn fan. I've never liked her ever since that last page of the Batman Adventures one shot where she says it felt like a kiss. The minute I read that, I said, I hate this character and I hate where they're going to go with this character. And it's been a while. So it's been 20, 30 years now that I've not liked Harley Quinn. I realize that this maybe isn't the best place to jump in and try to get an appreciation for Harley Quinn, but it definitely doesn't help. Worth it if you're a Mark Russell fan. It's kind of tired. His jokes are funny, but they're no funnier than something that a friend of yours that has a comic podcast or just talks about comics a lot wouldn't come up with on their own. There's a couple one-panel gags that were sort of funny. Two of them actually involving Mr. Freeze, which really made me chuckle. There's a panel shot of Lex Luthor stealing pies, which tickled me to no end. Mark Russell must be about my age or sort of wallowed in my age of comics, so he's going to speak my language when it comes to jokes like that. So Harley Quinn's villain of the year. If I talk too much more about it, it's just going to get more and more negative. I would give it, again, a 3 out of 5, except for if this was a series, I wouldn't read any further. The difference between this and Star is Star told a story, and it built characters, and it left promise, it left premise, it left some room for something to continue from there on. And so, if it's well written, even if it isn't your favorite thing, you'll want to continue that series. These one shots, from the beginning, it's one and done, and it's sort of hard to sell it to someone reading. But it did what it set out to do. It was fine. I hope Mark Russell got paid pretty well for it. And his writing was spot on. I mean, you're hiring someone who's capable of writing something that is going to be talked about for years to write for something that just needed published for today. And I'm glad to see that DC does those sorts of things. They trust these writers. They let them have fun. They let them have the sandbox for an hour, and you get stuff like this. This could have been even more of a train wreck, but it wasn't. But so I gave it a 3 because I think it was pretty solid for what it is, but not the greatest. It is kind of fun to see everybody sketched into the background and try to find all your favorite villains. Good gag in there about Scarface too, which is pretty funny. So overall, now that I think about it, there was a lot of little chuckles in there. And writing comedy isn't easy, you guys. The fact that Mark Russell is so consistently good at it is a huge nod to his talent. The third one that is also an attempt, I think, at writing comedy that lands flat is a Marvel comic called The Amazing Mary Jane. This apparently is a mini-series or a solo series that they know is doomed from the start. I'm not really sure how to take it. But the premise is that she's been hired to be a superhero in a movie that happens within Marvel Superhero Central, and it involves her and Mysterio falling in love and becoming basically an adventuring duo. It's pretty stupid. It is stupid. And unlike the Harley Quinn book, it isn't written in the tone, in the format. If you're going to do zany and stupid, Teen Titans Go is the way to go. But if you're going to make it wordy and try to be clever and try to fill panels with characterization, it sucks the life out of you to read it. And this is one of those comic books that just sucks the life out of you. If you're a huge fan of Mary Jane and just want to see her solo, this might be a book for you. But this is different than a solo Lois Lane book or a Jimmy Olsen book, because Mary Jane is very bland, and it's going to take a lot to get that character to be interesting. Not because she's bland necessarily, it's just that there's nothing about her immediately that jumps off the page. She's not an investigative reporter. She's Spider-Man's girlfriend who happens to be a model. Maybe she's fought some villains from time to time because, she's spunky and she's going to get in the mix, but she doesn't have superpowers. She really doesn't have any sort of gravity in a world full of superpowered villains and heroes. So it's going to take some work to write a book about her that has any sort of fun and sort of resonance and is honest to who she is as a character. I felt like this didn't really do her any favors, and it doesn't do the reader any favors. It has Mysterio in it, which I wonder if this wasn't planned to kind of piggyback off of the last Spider-Man movie, but it is the worst version of Mysterio I've ever read. I'm trying to, again, keep these positive, but it just wasn't very good. I don't think you could make me read another one of these, but if it shows up in my next stack that I buy from them, I will read it because that's part of this challenge. but it was kind of yucky. It was just a yucky comic book. There was one ridiculous scene in here that I do have to mention, and I just want to flip through here. Um, right in the middle of the comic book, and I'm not going to be able to pull it up, so forget it. But there's a scene involving Mysterio clapping back at somebody, and they take the gag way too far. And it sucked. It was terrible. And I don't know what editorial does with this tier of comic book. I just don't understand. I mean, they obviously have their sights set a little bit lower. They're not trying to write the Dark Knight Returns here. You know, this isn't going to be Demon in a Bottle. But there has to be some guidance, I think, when they look at the finished thing and say, like, yeah, that read fine. All three of these comics I read today were better than the 2099 comic. They all were easier to read. They had a linear flow. For that reason, even though I'm giving this a 2 out of a 5, it's a much different 2 out of a 5 than 2099. 2099, at least when you read it, you knew that it was establishing something, even though it was doing it poorly. This just felt like they had a bunch of action figures and they were going to tell a story for reasons, and it wasn't very good. Of all the comic books I've read so far, I have to say, I think the art in this one is the best. I think this had the most comic booky, enjoyable, colorful art out of all 6 books that I've read so far. If not the best, it's second only to Star, which had very good art as well, although very different, you know, like Tough Girl superhero art, whereas this one was more comic booky and again, colorful, had a nice comic book palette. So those are my 3 comics of the day. I'd be curious to hear what you think if you read any of these or if you followed these series either prior to these with the characters or after. Of course, that Harley Quinn is a one-shot. I'm sure some of you out there like Harley Quinn, and you can explain to me why why you like her. But for me, it wasn't the best ride. So all in all, I had 2 threes and a 2. Not too bad. Not too bad. I'm not expecting to get a 5 out of here because what I expect out of a 5 is pretty big. And I have adjusted my scores a little bit considering these are just random issues and the fact that I am completely ignorant to what's going on in both Marvel and DC currently. But, you know, a 3-star comic book is pretty good. And that means every penny you spent on it, you got back in enjoyment. You're going to put it in a pile and move on. So that's all I want out of a comic book, you guys. That's really all that I want out of a comic book. A 4 of a 5 or a 5 becomes a liability because then it becomes an obsession. I want to read about it. I want to keep the comics nice. I want to know when the nice trade edition is going to come out because I want it on my shelf until the next big purge. As you can see, not many comic books on my shelf up there. Some up there. There's some down there. But comic books have a short shelf life for me anymore. But a 4 out of 5 will hang around. And a 3 does exactly what I want a comic book to do. A 2, I haven't had a 1 yet. So we're doing good. Again, this is Carl's COVID Comics Challenge. I've said it differently every single time I've said it. I might as well call it the 4C challenge or the 3C challenge. I guess 4C challenge doesn't make any sense because challenge is one of the C's. But my voice is a little froggy today. I'm a little tired. You can tell the energy a little different, and I do apologize for that. But I'm going to continue this. It's not because of these comics. They didn't suck the life out of me or anything. It's just things are weird out there, and they're super weird for your local retailers. So support local businesses. I do have one thing I want to mention here right at the end. I had some questions as to what's going to happen to these comic books when I'm done reading them. I've purchased them, now what? So I'm one that I would be just as thrilled to just throw them in the trash as anything. I don't feel like I need to hang on to them forever. However, I have made sort of a custom of handing out my comic books, giving them away to other people once I've read them and they move on. Even with back issues, if I buy a big run, I'll read them, I'll hand them off to someone else, and everybody gets the enjoyment. But what I'm going to do with these is, as long as the schools are still sequestered during COVID, when I'm done reading these, I'm going to stuff them into little libraries near the schools here in town, and I will contact the teachers. You know, my kids' school is just up the street. I will contact the teachers and let them know I put them in there, and maybe the kids can read some semi-new comic books for free, which again, much like getting comic books through a drive-through, is what heaven will be like. Will be like is just free comic books for the reading. Until next time, this is Carl. Please support your local comic book stores. And if you don't have a local store, I have two that will mail stuff to you. I love you all. Take care. Be healthy. Be safe. I hope you find some toilet paper out there. Good night.